Should be one way or the other. Okay. All right. So when I was young, I remember my dad and my grandfather helping us to build a fort in our backyard. Right? It's one of the more distinct memories I have of my grandfather. This was, when I say build a fort, what I mean was this was like a plywood shed up on stilts. Okay? This was a fort. I mean, it was for real. I mean, you had command of the entire backyard when you were in the fort. All right? We painted it camouflage and everything. It was ready to go. Now, I'm not sure why this particular project sticks in my mind, but I do recall going with Dad and Grandpa to the Menards to buy lumber for this project. And for some reason, what I remember is my grandpa complaining about the general quality of the lumber that was available at the lumberyard compared to when what he had used when he was a carpenter and when he was still working as a carpenter. And one thing I remember is him picking up those 2x4s one after another, picking them up and setting them aside because they weren't any good, because they were all warped and they were all crowned and they were all bent out of shape. Right? Now, I mean, and it's one of those things, right? None of those pieces of lumber were very straight. And of course, if you're trying to build a square wall with curved lumber, that's not the easiest thing to do, right? So he was picky and choosy about that. But there's kind of a general principle here that something that ought to be straight but isn't very useful, right? So if that 2x4 is supposed to be straight but it's not, well then we've got a problem. Try using a ruler that's bent, okay? Or try baking on a pan that's warped, right? These things are frustrating and difficult sometimes because it's supposed to be straight, it's supposed to be flat, and it's not. Right? Now that's really the idea that I want to look at today in the book of Proverbs. And by its very nature, the book of Proverbs is filled with short, punchy statements of wisdom that are really best grouped by theme rather than by chapter. And so last week we considered the subject of the fear of Yahweh, which I said was really the central theme of the entire book of Proverbs. Everything really relates to that subject. If you get that, then you'll do all right. Right? If you fear the Lord, you'll find wisdom, honor, success, life. But on the other hand, if you despise God and refuse to submit to Him, then you will find your way quite difficult, and the end will be disaster. Now today, I want to move on to another major theme, and this one may be the most extensive in the book of Proverbs. And that is the contrast between righteousness and wickedness. Now there's a lot in Proverbs about these two things. I could really make an entire sermon series on righteousness versus wickedness. And I'm not going to do that now. Instead, here's what my plan is. Okay, I'll just let you in on what the goal is. The goal is this Sunday and next Sunday, I want to try to help us get an overview of what Solomon has to say about these two contrasting qualities of righteousness and wickedness. Today, my focus is primarily chapters 10 through 19, roughly. And again, we're just going to sample a few things here, okay? But my study this week has been chapters 10 through 19. All right, next week it's going to be 20 through 29. We're going to try to do that. Just, by the way, if that sounds like a lot to you, it is, okay? And it's been an awful lot of a bite to try to chew this week, and then next week I'm anticipating the same thing. But when we're done, we will have only looked at a few, really, of the dozens of Proverbs on this theme. And so my plan, I changed course a little bit on this from last week, because last week it was a little bit overwhelming. And I think my plan is that next Sunday, in addition to that sermon next Sunday, I want to give you a study guide on righteousness and wickedness in the book of Proverbs, okay? That will allow you to have more of the details and to go a little bit deeper into the topic, okay? So we're just going to try to touch on a few things today, and then next week I'm going to try to give you something that you can take as a resource that will help you to get a better handle on this idea and this topic, okay? Now, what does all this have to do with the idea of something being straight? Why do I introduce it by talking about 2x4s that are crowned? Well, because the basic meaning, the really root meaning behind the Hebrew word for righteousness is to be straight. And it came over time to refer to an ethical or moral standard. I think we can kind of see where that would start. The idea of something being straight, and then over time that idea of something being straight becomes applied to what's right and wrong, a moral standard. There's a standard, there's a straight line of what is right and wrong. And does something conform to that? Does it actually line up with what's right and wrong or not? And by the way, in the Old Testament, what is the ultimate ethical and moral standard? Anybody help me out with that? In the Old Testament, what is the ultimate standard of what is morally and ethically right? What's that? Yeah, God's will, God's law, God, His own nature, His own person. Okay? So, as we think about when we talk about this idea of righteousness, we're talking here about something that aligns with the standard, something that is straight and measures up to the standard, which is God and His will. So, the question, maybe to put it this way, is your life straight or is it bent out of shape? Does it line up with the standard of God's will? To put it in the vernacular of Proverbs, are you righteous or are you wicked? Right? Look with me for just a second. Proverbs chapter 10. I'm going to read a couple verses here, and then we're going to pray together. Proverbs 10, verse 27 and 28. The fear of the Lord prolongs days, but the years of the wicked will be shortened. The hope of the righteous will be gladness, but the expectation of the wicked will perish. Let's pray. Father, thank you for giving us your word. Thank you for giving us the book of Proverbs. Thank you for teaching us about the nature of righteousness, which really is a study of you and yourself. As we consider what it means to be righteous, we see your own nature, your own will, your own law being reflected, because this is who you are. Your character is the standard of moral and ethical behavior. And as we look at that, we realize pretty soon that our lives don't measure up. And Lord, if we're going to be honest, we have to confess that we often fall short of the standard. Our lives don't line up. I pray that you'd help us today. First of all, help us to see areas in our life that maybe don't line up with your expectation, your standard of what we ought to be. And then, Lord, help us to be humble and confess our sin to you. Help us to come to you so that you can straighten us out rather than defying you. Lord, I pray that you give us hearts that desire to be righteous, that want to live in the way of righteousness and not want to turn away from evil and wickedness. Father, I pray that you would help us today, shape us and mold us according to your word and by your Spirit. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. I really only have two very kind of basic, straightforward principles today to share with you about this, because I'm just trying to kind of put this together. The first principle that we're going to start is this: choosing righteousness or wickedness determines and reveals your true character. Right? Choosing righteousness or wickedness determines and reveals your true character. You know, every summer I like to plant a little garden. I don't have a huge area, but we've got a handful of raised garden beds, and I try to grow some things in the garden that I think we'll eat. I try to grow tomatoes every year and beans and kind of whatever else that I think the kids and Paulette and I will eat. And so I've had mixed success. Okay, I'm certainly not a professional gardener or anything like that. And so this year I planted some lettuce, a couple of different varieties of lettuce, and they were all growing and looking very nice, and everything was coming along just nice. Especially, I planted some iceberg lettuce, and iceberg really seemed to do well. I mean, looking at it, just got these beautiful big heads of lettuce that were growing, and I thought, this is great. I'm good, because this is something that we'll eat. This is something the kids will eat. This is something that our family will use. It's wonderful. And just because a head of lettuce looks good on the outside doesn't mean it's going to be good to eat, though, right? That's the problem. Okay. Other than a handful or two, really, of some stray leaves on those heads of lettuce, all of them were bad on the inside. Right? And as I would tear into them, they would all have brown and slimy thing. It was gross. Okay. We didn't really get very much of them at all. Right? And this question of righteousness and wickedness is kind of like those heads of lettuce. It's not always about what things look like on the outside. It's really about what's inside. That's where it really matters. So Proverbs has a lot to say about the internal workings of the righteous and the wicked. We're trying to contrast these two and understand the nature of the righteous person, the nature of the wicked person. What do these people look like? What are they like? Well, Proverbs really, I think, tells us that there's a lot internally that's going on. For example, chapter 12 and verse 5. The thoughts of the righteous are right, but the counsels of the wicked are deceitful. In other words, if we could see the thought lives of these two individuals, the righteous person and the wicked person, what would we see? Well, we would see that one, his thoughts are right, they're just, they're pure, they're good. The other one, though, is hiding impurity and sin. Of course, the problem is we can't read somebody else's thoughts, can we? Right? So, how do we tell the difference? Well, the very next verse, Proverbs 12:6, kind of gives us an indication. It says, the words of the wicked are, quote, lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright will deliver them. There's a principle here. There's a direct connection between your thoughts and your words. No one can see your thoughts, but your words reveal a great deal about you. And so, if we're going to consider here the nature, the character of the righteous person versus the wicked person, what does he tell us? He tells us that the thoughts of the righteous person are right. They think in right and upright categories. They think in pure and with truth and in justice and integrity. But the person who is wicked thinks dishonestly and deceitfully. In fact, they are in their hearts are deceitful. Their mouth, he says, is really full of violence. They say, lie in wait for blood. There's a huge stark difference between the two when we think about the thoughts, and the thoughts then lead to words. Again, in chapter 12 and verse 20, he says, deceit is in the heart of those who devise evil. Again, look at the heart. What is the heart like of this person who is wicked? His heart is deceitful. He's devising evil things. He's scheming and plotting and imagining evil things. But counselors of peace have joy. And so, I think this challenges us right off the bat. What do your thoughts and your words say about you? Now, there's something else that's interesting about the wicked man here, and especially when it comes to words, because, and this is kind of the point I'm trying to make here with this kind of overarching principle. Righteousness and wickedness is a choice that we make, and that choice will reveal your character. The thoughts of your heart, the words that you use reveal your character, but they also determine your character. Because there's an influence as well. And that's what he talks here in chapter 17 and verse 4. He says, an evildoer gives heed to false lips. A liar listens eagerly to a spiteful tongue. This is interesting because it has to do with what the wicked person chooses to listen to. What does he choose to listen to? Well, he listens to false lips, lying, a spiteful tongue. In other words, he surrounds himself with people who are like him, people who speak the way he speaks, who will speak falsely and deceptively and with intent to harm and do evil. There's a harmony here between the way that an evil person's heart works and the people he surrounds himself with. And that's because the choice to think and speak wickedly leads to habits of wickedness. And so in that way, the choice is determinative, right? We choose to do wicked things, and then that leads us in a path of wickedness. But it also reveals something about what is already present within us. And so I think what we see here when we examine what the Proverbs have to say about the righteous and the wicked is that there's a natural flow, right, from within to without. Right? We can look at the heart and we can say, well, the heart is deceptive, it's false, it's cruel, it's wicked. It leads to words that are very similar, devising evil things and coming up with plots and schemes to do evil things. And then it surrounds itself. It surrounds itself with others who are also wicked. And so in so doing, kind of creates this culture of wickedness. Again, chapter 17, still there in chapter 17, verse 20, it says, he who has a deceitful heart finds no good, and he who has a perverse tongue falls into evil. By the way, is it surprising that the person who has a deceitful heart doesn't find any good? Is he looking for it? No, that's the point. Right? His heart is deceitful. His heart is wicked. He's not finding good because he's not after it. He's not interested. He doesn't have good in his heart. Therefore, he's not looking for it. He's not putting himself in position where he's going to run across it. And then it says, the man with a perverse tongue falls into evil. And that's a really polite way to say this. Because again, he's not looking for good. This is a person whose heart is wicked and evil and corrupt. And what is he looking for? He's looking for evil. So yes, he falls into evil, but it's not like he stumbles into it. It's not like it was unexpected. The whole concept here of what we see as we kind of examine, and obviously at this point, most of what we've read is about the wicked person. But as we think about that, a deceitful heart, a perverse tongue, and an evil life, they all just seem to fit together in one piece, don't they? And so this then develops into a habit, a life pattern. And this life pattern is one of wickedness and evil. I'm still there in chapter 17. There's another verse I want to look at. Verse 13. It says, whoever rewards evil for good, evil will not depart from his house. I think this is interesting because this kind of connects another dot for us. We look at the heart. The heart's tied to the mouth. The heart and mouth then lead to actions. Has to do with who you associate yourself with, the kind of influences that you bring into your life. But then notice here, there's a sense in which this evil, this life of corruption, this habit, this habitual wickedness, what does it do? It has an outward influence as well. Because he says here that whoever rewards evil for good, well, what could be more despicable than to do evil as a reward for someone doing good to you. Right? This is about the lowest kind of thing you can think of. Someone does good and you respond, you repay them by doing evil to them. Right? And he says here, whoever does that, evil will not depart from his house. Now, when we hear the word house, we might immediately think of the four walls that you live in, but that's not what he's talking about. When he uses the word house, what's he talking about? He's talking about a household. He's talking about a family. What he says here is if you choose to deal in evil instead of good, the corruption is not going to be contained in your life. That corruption is going to be like an infection, and it's going to spread out from you, and not just in your immediate vicinity, but even into future generations. I think about what Moses said in Exodus chapter 20. Exodus 20, verse 5, in giving the Ten Commandments. And here's, of course, Moses is speaking, quoting the Lord. He says, I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. Now, this doesn't, we see there's a biblical principle. God doesn't punish children because their parents sin. That's not what he's saying here. What he's saying is your sin has an impact. Your sin, and you can't contain it. You don't get to just wall it off and say, no, my sin, that's just for me. It only affects me. No. Your sin affects others. And he says, if you hate him, he says to the Israelites, that sin, God says, I will punish that to the third and fourth generations. It will not be contained in your life. It will carry on and echo down generation after generation. Now, in the very next verse, which I'm not reading, in the very next verse, he says that he'll have mercy on those who love him. Right? So there's no sort of blanket idea here of generational curses and all that kind of stuff. That's just paganism, by the way. But the point of what he's saying is, if you oppose him, if you choose wickedness, if you choose that life, and you make that your desire, well, it's going to infect your entire family. It's going to have an impact beyond just you. Now, this same principle applies to the righteous. So we've kind of looking at here so far, examining mostly the wicked. Right? What about the righteous? Well, same principle. Go with me, chapter 16 and verse 17. And I know we're just bouncing around, and I'm sorry, but that's just the nature of it. There's not a lot of other options here, okay? Chapter 16 and verse 17. He says this, the highway of the upright is to depart from evil. He who keeps his way preserves his soul. So this is the contrast. We have the wicked man who has wicked thoughts that lead to wicked words and a wicked life. The upright, on the other hand, what does the upright man do? He turns away from evil. To him, he says, this is a highway. And what he means by that is, doing right becomes the path of least resistance for the righteous person. Right? It becomes the habit of your life. That's the idea of a highway. Right? A highway is cleared of obstructions. And that's what we have. I think, not that it ever works this way, but when you drive through Chicago, that's the express lane, right? You're laughing because the express lane is not, everybody tries to take the express, right? But the idea is we eliminate some of the exits along the way. And therefore, we should be able to go faster through that because we don't have to worry about people getting on and off. Right? Same concept of the turnpike. We used to we used to cross Oklahoma on the turnpike. And if you're going to get off the turnpike, you got like 50 miles. The exits are really spaced wide apart. Right? So in theory, man, you can just crank it up and fly because there's not a lot of traffic. It's wide open, not a lot of people getting on and off. You can just drive. Well, that's true. That's the idea here. This is the highway for the righteous person, is to turn away from evil. This is the highway. This is the unobstructed road. This is the path of least resistance for him. It's the habit of his life. Understand here that it says that the highway is to depart from evil, and he who keeps his way preserves his soul. There are significant stakes here. The stakes are very high. You see, the world will tell you, well, if you want, you can, of course, if you want, you can be religious. If you want, you can be one of those Jesus people who follows, what was it? Bobby said, was it last week? He said about being accused of being a goody two-shoes. You can be that if you want, our world will tell you. That's one lifestyle you can choose, but there are others that you can choose from. There are alternatives. I like the way Pastor John Kitchen explains this verse, because that's not what Proverbs says. Here's what he says about this. He says, the way we live our lives is not a matter of alternative lifestyles, but of life and death. The fear of the Lord steers one into the path of life. That's what he says here. Turning away from evil is a highway. It is the way of life for the righteous person. Now, just like the wicked man, we can identify the righteous man. How? By his speech. Okay? Go back to chapter 10 and verse 11. Chapter 10 and verse 11. The mouth of the righteous is a well of life, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. The wicked man's words reveal a heart of deceitfulness, a desire to do violence. But what about the righteous man? Well, his words are a well or a fountain. Again, picture yourself stranded in the desert, right? You walk all day in the blazing hot sun. Your lips are chapped, your skin is burned, your strength is almost gone. And then you stumble upon a spring of water that bubbles up clear and cold out of the ground. That is what the mouth of the righteous is like, he said. A well, a fountain that produces life. How precious is that? How much is it worth to you wandering through that desert to find that spring of water? It's everything. We'll look down at verse 20, chapter 10, verse 20. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver. Here's how valuable it is. Choice silver. The heart of the wicked is worth little. Verse 21, the lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for lack of wisdom. What's it worth? Well, that water bubbling up in the desert is priceless. He says it's like choice silver. It's a great value. The heart of the wicked, it's not worth anything. It doesn't produce anything. It doesn't help anyone. It doesn't give life. It doesn't reward anyone. There's no benefit there. So here's the question for you to think about. Do your words bring life to those around you? To your family? To your neighbors? Or are you always stirring up trouble and sparking conflict? That's just another way of asking, are you righteous or are you wicked? And so the choice here, righteousness or wickedness, it determines your character, it determines what you are, and it reveals it as well. But there's another principle that we want to look at, and that is this. Choosing righteousness or wickedness leads to certain consequences. And when I say certain, what I mean is consequences that absolutely follow. Right? One of the things I remember about when I was a child, I remember being a little bit puzzled by this, was about how signs worked on the highway. Maybe you can relate. I mean, when I was a kid, eventually I figured it out, okay? But we'd get on the interstate, and I'd see a sign that would say Detroit, or Chicago, or Minneapolis. But we weren't going to Detroit, or Chicago, or Minneapolis. But that's what the sign said. And I was like, well, wait, why do we got to take that exit? We're not going to Detroit. Why do we got to take that exit? We're not going to Minneapolis. What's the deal? I don't understand. The sign says that, but that's not where we're going. I couldn't figure out why we have to take an exit that says it when it goes to one city when we didn't want to go to that city. We wanted to go somewhere else. Again, eventually, as I got older, I realized those highways went to a lot of different cities. So they were just pointing us in a general direction. Those highways aren't dead ends that lead to only one place. But the choice, according to Proverbs, the choice that you make between righteousness and wickedness is not like the interstate highway system. There's not lots of directions. You can't just take a general, it's not, you can get off wherever you please. No. The choice has a definite, a certain end. You know, sometimes on the interstate highway, you have to take a west highway if you want to go east. I don't know if you ever run into that issue. That can be confusing, especially around some cities. You got to get on the west highway if you want to go east, and vice versa, right? It's not how this works. See, in the book of Proverbs, if you choose the path of righteousness, there is a certain end that you can expect, and it's the same if you choose the wicked way. Just consider a couple of examples. Turn to chapter 13. Chapter 13, verse 9, for example. The light of the righteous rejoices, but the lamp of the wicked will be put out. I think that this imagery is really interesting, and as you think about this, when he talks about the light or the lamp, what is that? Well, there's probably several ways or several levels in which we could kind of consider that image. Right? Maybe you've been one time, walking in the woods at night or someplace where you were away from city lights. And it's really helpful to have a flashlight, but what if your battery goes out while you're walking in the middle of the, And that's kind of the picture here, right? See, he says the light of the righteous rejoices, but the lamp of the wicked will be put out. The wicked person has a lamp, they have a light, but it gets put out. They end up in darkness. Well, what does that imply? One, it implies that they end up not knowing where they're going. If you don't have a light, it's really hard for you to see where you're going. It's hard for you to see obstacles and obstructions. It's a lot easier for you to fall and get hurt. You're a lot more likely to get lost because you don't have a light. But there's also a sense in which this idea of the lamp or the light really kind of is tied to life itself. The person whose lamp is put out, it's like, remember, they're not dealing with flashlights, they're dealing with oil lamps. And you put that wick out, it's out. The person whose lamp is put out is a person whose life is over. And so there's some implications here. The righteous man, he has a light. His light doesn't go out. In fact, his light brings rejoicing. I think there's a sense here in which the righteous have insight. They have a light that helps them to know where to go. But they also have success, because if you have the light that helps you know where to go, you're going to be able to find success. You're going to be able to get where you want to go. And of course, they have life. But the wicked, in contrast, wanders around in the darkness, constantly facing trouble. Fear. Boy, have you ever been in a really dark place? And then you start hearing some noises? Right? Fear. I've long believed that the fear of the unknown is much more terrifying than the known. So it's those things when you're in the dark. That's why kids are afraid of the dark. Maybe it's not just kids. I don't know. No one has to admit to that today. Okay, but just saying, right? Why is the darkness terrifying? Because we don't know. Because you can't see. That's what he says. He says, the righteous man, his lamp rejoices, but the wicked, his lamp is put out. He is cast into darkness, uncertainty, fear, and then ultimately death. These are the consequences. Now, also there in chapter 13, I didn't write down the number, so I can't, the verse number now, so I don't know which verse this is. You can look through the whole chapter, I guess, and try and find it. But it's in the same chapter. He says, evil pursues sinners, but to the righteous good shall be repaid. It's verse 21. Evil pursues sinners, but to the righteous good shall be repaid. I said at the beginning, the wicked man falls into evil. He doesn't find good. Why? Because he's not looking for it. Well, this kind of gives us a little bit of a different twist on that, right? Evil pursues sinners. He can't even get away from it if he tried. It has a magnetic quality to it. His own evil, wicked heart and his own corruption has a magnetic quality that draws evil to him. But the same thing is true for the righteous, just on the other side. Again, think of a magnet. It's the two poles of a magnet. Right? They both have an attractive power, they just attract different things. And that's what happens with the wicked and the righteous. The wicked is attracting evil, attracting sin, attracting wickedness to himself. So it's no wonder that he is surrounded by people like himself who are deceivers, who are violent, immoral, and corrupt. And I appreciated Phil when he was speaking a few weeks ago, sharing a little bit of his testimony. And I think if you were to go into more of the detail of it, how when you start to get down that path of sin and you start to follow that with your life, and your life begins characterized, the people that you end up around and the influences, you always seem to find those influences, don't you? You always seem to find those people. This is a problem with addiction, is that when we're an addict, we always seem to find the people that can feed the addiction. They're attracted to us. Why? Because this is the principle here. Evil pursues sinners, he says. There's an attractiveness. There's a magnetism that draws it in. And so, righteousness, again, is the same, but on the opposite side. It has its own reward. Turn to chapter 14, verse 32. Just consider this. Again, the wicked is banished in his wickedness, but the righteous has a refuge in his death. It's a powerful statement. Even in death, the righteous man has a refuge, a place of safety. And again, the Old Testament, we don't have time to go into this today, but the Old Testament presents to us the refuge. Who is the refuge? It's God. He is our refuge and our strength. Over and over again, the book of Psalms asserts that God is our refuge. The righteous man, even in death, what does he find? Refuge. That's a powerful statement. Some people have tried, by the way, they've tried to suggest that the Hebrew in that verse is corrupted and needs to be fixed because death, they don't think that fits. It must be something else. And so they try to rearrange it to get it to say something else. No, I think that's exactly what it means, because I think it's demonstrating Solomon's faith that God, even in death, God preserves and cares for the life of those who are righteous. There is refuge even in death for those who trust in the Lord, for those who fear Him. What does the wicked have? He's banished, he says. The righteous has refuge. Now, I think the best place, though, for us to kind of consider this idea of the contrasting outcomes of the righteous and wicked is back in chapter 11. So let's just turn there. We're going to kind of park in chapter 11 for the rest of the time that we have here, because this is one of those places where this theme of the righteous and the wicked and where they end up is really kind of a thread running through chapter 11 especially. And so we'll see it here. Look at the beginning of verse 3. And we're going to read down through a good part of this chapter. He says this in verse 3, "The integrity of the upright will guide them, but the perversity of the unfaithful will destroy them. Riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. The righteousness of the blameless will direct his way aright, but the wicked will fall by his own wickedness. The righteousness of the upright will deliver them, but the unfaithful will be caught by their lust." You know, there's a sense here in which God's justice is poetic. Right? Whatever you choose, whether it's the righteous or the wicked, it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Again, notice the way he describes the wicked in these verses. They are crooked, untrustworthy, and ultimately he says they are slaves. They are trapped in their own desires. And what do they get in return? What is the end result for those who pursue the path of wickedness. Well, according to verse 6, this is where he says it describes it very powerfully. He says they are caught by their lust. So here, let me just get you to think about this for a second. Have you ever set a mouse trap? How many of you have set a mouse trap before? Okay. When you set a mouse trap, what do you put in the trap? Cheese? Peanut butter? Anybody else have a better thing that they use? I'm just curious. I want to know, like, what's the best? Chocolate syrup? Oh, I never thought about that. No. If you want to waste good chocolate syrup. No, okay. That's how I feel about putting peanut butter on there. I'm like, put peanut butter on. I hate wasting that. But then again, So why do you put that on the trap? Why do you put cheese or peanut butter or chocolate syrup or something else? Why do you put that on the trap? Because it tempts them. It's something that they want. It's something that they like. If you want to trap mice, you have to use something they like as bait. Okay? So in other words, you could put it this way. You could say the mouse is caught by its lust for peanut butter or cheese or chocolate syrup. I was trying to find out this week if there's anything mice don't like to eat, and I really couldn't find anything. Okay. They'll eat just about anything that's edible, and some things that are not. Okay. But the truth is that, if you want to attract them, to get them to come into the trap, you bait it with something they like, and they end up caught by their own lusts, their own desires. That's the picture here. It's the same thing with wickedness. If you choose to follow your heart, that's what our world says we should do. Listen to popular music, media, popular culture. What do you hear over and over again? You have to follow your heart. You have to do what you love. If you do that and you do what you desire, Proverbs warns you, and this is the reality, you will end up caught in a deadly trap by your own lust, your own desire. That will trap you. That will be the very thing that ensnares you. On the other hand, what does it say here about the righteous? In these verses? Well, they're guided by their integrity in verse 3. They're delivered from death in verse 4. Verse 5 is interesting. He says the New King James says he'll direct his way aright. The idea is that the way that they take is smoothed out and the path is cleared of obstruction. This is the idea that the righteous follow a smooth path. So here's the question. Which do you prefer? Which outcome do you prefer? To be snared and caught in a trap of your own desires, or to be delivered from death, to follow a smooth path and have the light of your integrity to guide you? Now look at verse 7. He continues. When a wicked man dies, his expectation will perish, and the hope of the unjust perishes. The righteous is delivered from trouble, and it comes to the wicked instead. The hypocrite with his mouth destroys his neighbor, but through knowledge the righteous will be delivered. When it goes well with the righteous, the city rejoices, and when the wicked perish, there is jubilation. By the blessing of the upright, the city is exalted, but it is overthrown by the mouth of the wicked. So what does the wicked man live for? What is he all about? Himself. He lives for himself. So what's left when the thing he lives for comes to an end? Because guess what? It always does, isn't it? Right? You might even escape taxes. You're not going to escape death. Okay? But what is he? He lives for himself. When that comes to an end, what's left? Nothing. He has no hope beyond that. That's what this is saying. When he dies, even his hope dies. Even his expectation dies. His dreams die. There's nothing beyond this life because this is all he's lived for. Solomon says he's consumed with himself and his own sinful desires. And Pastor Kitchen says this, the one who does not know or honor God eventually sees all his hopes and dreams die. He lives only for this life. He has lived for himself, and when the object of his desire passes, there is no more dream. How could there be? He's lived for himself. He's lived for this life, for the here and now. That's all he lives for. And as a result, when this is over, there's nothing. But the righteous man, and this is the contrast here, the righteous man is so much more than his own desires, his own dreams. His life blesses those around him. Notice what it says in verse 10. It talks about the way the community rejoices. The community rejoices when the righteous man is successful. Why? Because his success is their success. See, he improves the world around him. He's living for something beyond himself. Right? And one of the things that people love to do, especially on the internet, is argue about who is the greatest athlete of all time. Okay? And you can, if you want to waste a lot of time, you can get involved in those arguments. Now, it's because they're silly arguments, right? It's always comparing apples to oranges, right? You can't compare somebody that played a sport 30 years ago to somebody who played a sport today. The sports are different, people are different, everything's different, right? No comparison. But there is a key component that almost everybody agrees on when we're looking at this argument of who is the greatest. What makes an athlete a great athlete? What puts them in that top, the best of the best, as opposed to just being a really good athlete, but what puts them in that really upper echelon? One thing that separates them is not their own personal abilities. It's how they make other people around them better. It's that guy who is able to transform a bunch of other athletes into a team that is successful. That guy is greater, you argue, because he elevates those around him. His influence improves them. And then Solomon says this is true, generally speaking, of the righteous. He says when they succeed, the entire community rejoices. Why? Because their success means success for everyone. They are going to elevate those around them. The city rejoices when they excel. Their words exalt and lift people up. That's verse 11. By the blessing of the upright. Here's what is blessing? We mentioned at the beginning of the service. It's to speak words that give favor, to bless others with their mouth. And it says their mouth does this. It exalts the city. It elevates the city. This is totally a side point that I didn't even plan on mentioning, but it's one of those things I think today where we see this just generally across the board. We see the level of speech just tanking. I mean, just the kind of language that people use, even people who are in positions of government authority and people that we would think are, at least supposedly have some kind of honor and have, and yet they speak with this crass, coarse, foul language and crude kinds of things, and it's not a good thing. It's not a good indication of where our society is heading. Because here, the righteous person's mouth, his language, his speech, it exalts the city. It elevates the city. It elevates the community around him. His speech actually has a way of bringing the community higher. We don't see very much of that today. And I'm not even just talking about political things, although obviously in politics we see a lot of it. But just as a general rule, it just seems like our speech is going the other direction. But I think that tells us something, doesn't it? Again, the speech is an indication of the nature of the heart. Because it says here in verse 11, the city is exalted because of the blessing or the speech of the upright, but the words, the mouth of the wicked, what does it accomplish? It overthrows the city. It has a negative downward impact that destroys. So again, what impact do your words and mine have on those around us? Is it righteous or wicked? Now look down to verse 18. Read another section here. Verse 18. The wicked man does deceptive work, but he who sows righteousness will have a sure reward. As righteousness leads to life, so he who pursues evil pursues it to his own death. Those who are of a perverse heart are an abomination to the Lord, but the blameless in their ways are his delight. Though they join forces, the wicked will not go unpunished, but the posterity of the righteous will be delivered. In very typical fashion for Solomon here, we end up with multiple metaphors on the table. Right? In verse 18, he seems to be speaking here about a farmer planting seed. Especially in the second half of that, right? The one man is sowing righteousness like seed in the ground. Again, think about that. Makes sense. The man who sows righteousness, he's planting a seed that he knows is going to bring forth a harvest, and that harvest is going to be good. Why? Because he's planting good seed. He knows the seed he's planting. He knows it's going to produce what he wants to have. On the other hand, the wicked man, and this is interesting, the wicked man seems to think that he can sow one thing and reap something else. That's the description here, is that he does deceptive work. As if he thinks he can sow one kind of seed, but he can receive a different kind of crop. Right? He can sow wickedness and he can reap success. He can sow violence and he can reap peace. He can sow lies and he can reap truth. He can sow death and he can reap life. But it doesn't work that way. You see, I think the reason that Solomon uses this metaphor, this idea of sowing seed, is important because we live in a world that we understand is governed by basic laws. And if you plant beans in the ground, what kind of plant are you going to get? You're going to get beans, right? Anybody ever had that go differently? Anybody ever experienced that where you planted one thing and you got something else? Other than weeds. Okay. Right? But that's a hard and fast rule. That's just the way the world works. And anybody who says otherwise, you're going, no, come on, you're either off your rocker or you're just fooling around. Because we know that whatever seed we plant, we're going to get that. That's a law of nature, right? And I think we're pretty confident of that. There's no exception to that. There's a law of nature. Whatever seed you plant, that's the plant you're going to get. But that's true not just when we plant seeds in the ground, but Solomon understands we can learn something from that. What you plant is what you're going to get. The same thing Solomon is saying is true when it comes to your character. What you plant is what you're going to get. The wicked man somehow thinks that he can plant seeds of wickedness, but he can reap something else. And Solomon says it doesn't work like that. When you plant the seeds of wickedness, what are you going to get? According to verse 19, here's where he changes metaphors. Verse 19, he's not talking about planting anymore. He says, righteousness leads to life, so he who pursues evil pursues it to his own death. Now he's back to talking about this road or a pathway. Right? Which way do you choose to go? There are only two paths, according to Solomon. There's only two ways you can go here. Right? You can't get to Detroit by driving toward Minneapolis. It doesn't work that way. The way of righteousness leads to life. And it is absolutely certain that if you pursue evil, you are actually pursuing your own death. Now let's just close with one more pair of Proverbs also from this chapter that I think illustrates the point very well. Verse 30 and 31. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he who wins souls is wise. If the righteous will be recompensed on the earth, how much more the ungodly and the sinner? Now think about the image that he's using here, especially in verse 30, for just a minute. He says the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life. Now notice he doesn't say it's the tree of life. Okay? Tempest, please turn around and face the front, please. Thank you. He doesn't say it is the tree of life, the one that was in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. He's talking about a tree of life. So we need to think about this a certain way. We like to eat fruit, okay? But that's not what he has in mind here. He's not talking about eating fruit. What's the primary purpose of the fruit that the tree produces? It's not really for you and I to eat. Why does the tree produce the fruit? Reproduction. The tree is producing fruit because that fruit contains the seed. And what's the goal of the seed? Why does the tree do this? Because when that seed is planted, it's going to grow up into a new tree. So what is Solomon saying about the righteous man or the righteous woman here? His life produces fruit like a tree. And that fruit sprouts and grows into, guess what? More righteous trees. That's the goal. He reproduces himself. By the way, that's what the second part of the proverb means too. You ever read this proverb before? The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he who wins souls is wise. Well, then we need to go out and win souls, right? Let's go out and evangelize. Now, I'm all for going to evangelize and sharing the gospel with other people. We need to do that. But that's not what he's talking about here. He's not talking about going out and trying to lead other people to become Christians necessarily. What he's talking about here is a wise man winning other people to wisdom. He says, he who wins souls is wise, or the wise one wins souls. The wise one wins people to be like himself. They say that success breeds success, and that's kind of what Solomon is saying here. Wisdom breeds wisdom. Righteous trees produce righteous fruit that grows up into righteous saplings. Now, there's a parenting principle here, of course. Right? If you're a parent and you pursue a life of righteousness, then what can you produce in your children? That offspring, that reproduction of righteousness. That's the goal. Right? But this is a much wider principle than that. It's not just parents. This applies in a much more universal sense. If you choose the path of righteousness, your life will produce life in others. Now, I like ending with this because it really describes what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. Right? When you trust Jesus to be your Savior, you are choosing the path of righteousness instead of the way of the wicked. Right? Again, just like last week we talked about the fear of the Lord and how the fear of the Lord ties in with the gospel. Right? To fear the Lord, you could argue that the fear of the Lord is essentially a synonym for believing and trusting in Him. Well, I think you could say the same thing here. That choosing the way of the righteous is really what you're doing when you trust in Jesus Christ. You're faced with that option. Listen, am I going to keep going my way? Am I going to keep living what I do? Am I going to keep trying to pursue life on my terms? Or am I going to say, you know what? It's not about me. It's not about what I want. No, Lord, it's about you and following you, and I'm going to choose life. I'm going to choose Jesus Christ over myself. Well, that's the choice of the righteous way. Because this whole concept of the righteous versus the wicked, I don't want to turn this into some sort of legalistic thing where you and I just get to check off our life. Do I do the good things? Do I do the bad things? No. This is what flows out of that relationship that we have with Jesus Christ. If you have trusted in Jesus Christ, you made the choice to go down the path of righteousness. But there's a reason that Solomon uses the imagery of a path or a roadway, because it's not just a one-time it's not just a one-time decision that then is divorced from the rest of your life. What happens when you choose to take that exit to go that direction? Well, if you want to get to that city, you got to keep going in that direction. You can't just take the exit and, all right, I'm there. The sign said Chicago. I'm there. No. That's 80 miles away. I got to follow the road to get there. I got to stay on the path. I got to keep going. And that's what he's talking about here. The choice to trust in Christ is the beginning then of a life of following the path of righteousness. You choose to turn toward righteousness and life, and being a disciple means you keep going down the path every day until you reach the end. So, are you a Christian? Have you trusted in Jesus Christ? If you have, then pursue the path of righteousness. Turn away from the way of evil. If you haven't yet trusted in Jesus Christ, then the decision is not really materially any different. You're called to do the same at this very moment. Turn away from the path of sin and choose the way of life, the path of righteousness. Trust in Jesus Christ. Jesus, His way is the way of righteousness. His way is the way